The clock read 12:47 a.m. Park Sung-jin had just walked through his front door, still wearing the cold from the street, still carrying the silence of a man who had just ended a very difficult conversation in a very quiet room. He dropped his keys, and that's when he heard it. Crying. Not one voice, three. Something ancient pulled him toward the hallway before his brain caught up. His children, his bobbies, and they were outside. The back door was open, October air cutting through the house like a blade. And there, on the cold stone floor of the back veranda, Sihua, Minjun, and little Hana, all three of them sitting tangled around each other the way toddlers do when there's no adult available, and so they become each other's comfort, crying in the dark. Pajamas, no shoes. And kneeling just behind them, back against the wall, face turned away from the light, was Zara. She didn't hear him, or maybe she did and she was past caring. Her knees were on the cold stone, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and she was crying in the way people cry when they've forgotten how to stop, not dramatically, not loudly, just continuously. Like something that had been leaking for a very long time and had finally burst all the way through. Park Sung-jin, the man his rivals called a ghost, the man whose own lieutenants said they'd never seen him blink first, stood in that doorway and did not know what to do. He had faced men with weapons. He had sat across from people who wanted him dead and smiled at them. He had never seen this. And somehow this was worse. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe right now and tap the bell. And drop a comment below. When did someone finally break through the walls of the most guarded person you've ever known? Tell me. Let's get into it. To understand what this moment meant, you need to understand what kind of man Park Sung-jin was in every room that wasn't this one. 37. Built his company, Park Strategic Holdings, from rubble after his father's empire collapsed publicly when Sung-jin was 19. He'd watched everything his family built get dismantled in a courtroom, watched his mother shield her face from cameras. He had decided at 19 that he would never be that exposed again. 18 years of making sure of it. He was respected, feared, occasionally despised, and sealed the kind of man women found magnetic and then discovered was like pressing your hand against a perfectly smooth wall, appealing from a distance, impossible to hold onto up close. He never let anyone in. He was not cruel about it. He was simply done before anyone got close enough to matter. Then 2 years ago, his brother died, and the triplets came home. 3 two-year-olds who had never met him, who didn't understand why their world had collapsed, who screamed for weeks every time a door slammed. He'd hired staff, nannies, a night nurse, did everything right and kept his distance from all of it because that's what he knew how to do. And then, 7 months ago, through an arrangement that had more to do with business than love, at least at the start, Zara arrived. She was supposed to manage his household, care for the children. He'd been clear this was transactional. What he had not been clear about, what he refused to examine, was what happened after she actually came. Within 2 weeks, all 3 children stopped having nightmares. Within a month, his house felt, for the first time, like someone actually lived there. Small things, a fruit bowl, a lamp that changed the energy of an entire room, a weekly rhythm the children had latched onto like a lifeline. He noticed all of it, filed it away, kept his distance. What he did not see, what he was too practiced at not seeing, was what it cost her. This is the part that's going to hit you. Zara had not come into this with her eyes closed. She was 29, educated, capable. She agreed because she loved her family and understood that sometimes love means accepting the shape of a situation even when it doesn't fit the shape you dreamed of. She told herself she would be fine. She had almost believed it. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside a house full of people. Not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of being invisible. Of doing everything right and having no one see it. Of pouring yourself out every single day into children who need you, into a home that needs you, into a life that is technically yours but holds no part of you inside it. She hadn't told anyone. Not her sister who called every Sunday. Not her father who thought he'd done right by her. Not the staff who respected her but kept professional distance. And definitely not Sung-jin, who moved through the house like a man passing through a lobby, present but already somewhere else. She managed, she smiled, she was good at both. But some weights don't get lighter just because you're strong enough to carry them. The triplets had started picking it up, the way children always do, with their terrifying instincts. Sihua climbing into her lap more. Minjun patting her face at random moments with the grave concern of a small person who knows something is wrong but has no language for it. Even Hana, the quietest, had started calling in the night, not for staff, not for Sung-jin, for her. Tonight had started the way real crises always do. Not with one catastrophic thing, with 17 small things that finally aligned into a perfect storm. The afternoon was normal. Snacks, a walk, the beautiful chaos of 3 toddlers who decided today was the day they became painters. She managed it all. And then at 6 o'clock, her sister called. Crying, a family situation back home that had been building for months. The kind of emergency that doesn't have an immediate solution, just requires you to be present in your feelings, to grieve a little, even when you have no space to. She got off the call, looked at the clock. Understood she did not have the luxury of falling apart because the children needed dinner, bath time, stories, and no one in this house was going to cover for her while she went to feel things privately. So she didn't. She made dinner, did the bath, read the stories, and somewhere in the middle of where the wild things are, Minjun looked up at her face and said, with devastating 3-year-old accuracy, "Zara sad." She smiled. "I'm okay, sweet boy." He didn't look convinced. He patted her cheek with his whole palm. And that was the moment she almost lost it. That tiny hand. That unfiltered, I see you concern from a child too young to understand what concern was, who just felt it and acted on it immediately, without hesitation, without calculating the risk. She held on, put them to bed, turned off the lights, and then stood in the kitchen in the dark, just to breathe. Just to allow herself 30 seconds of honest feeling before she packed it back away. 30 seconds became 3 minutes. 3 minutes became, she didn't know how long. Long enough that when she became aware of herself again, she was in the back hallway, sitting against the wall with no memory of getting there. And she was crying, not the quiet, managed kind, the real kind, the kind that has been waiting. She was so far inside it that she didn't hear the small bare feet on the floor, didn't register the soft sounds that always preceded the triplets getting out of bed. Not until 3 small bodies pressed against her all at once, Siwa in her lap, Minjun against her arm, Hana's face buried in her neck, did she realize they had come. They had woken up, found her, and because they were 3 years old and they loved her and had no other tools, they had simply come to her, the way she always came to them. She gathered them close, tried to stop crying because they were frightened and she was the adult. But the thing about being held by people who love you when you're breaking, it doesn't make you stop. It makes you break more fully, safer, more honest. She hadn't even registered they drifted outside. The door was open, she'd never closed it, and they'd followed her to the doorway and somehow they'd all ended up on the cold stone together. In the dark, in October. She knew she should get them inside. She knew she should compose herself. Her body was refusing. And that's when the door behind her opened. Still with me? Good, because this next part is the reason you clicked. Hit that like button right now and let's keep going. He didn't say anything at first. He stood in that doorway for almost a full minute, looked at all 4 of them, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no existing vocabulary for. He moved quietly, sat down on the cold stone, reached out carefully with the awareness of a man who knows he does not do this often and does not want to get it wrong, and gathered all 3 children against him without a word. They went to him immediately. That was the thing that cracked Zara all over again, watching how easily they folded into his chest, how fast their crying shifted from distressed to just the winding down sniffles of children who have been found. They knew he was safe, even with his distance. even with his absence. He was theirs and they knew it. He held them for a long time. Zara had stopped crying. Embarrassment does that, the cold water of someone else's presence snapping you back into yourself. She was wiping her face, straightening her back, preparing the version of herself that could say, "I'm fine. This won't happen again," convincingly enough that they could all move on. She was good at that. She had gotten very, very good at that. But then he looked at her. Not the quick assessing glance she was used to. Not the efficient once-over of a man calculating what a situation requires. He looked at her, the way you look at something you've been deliberately avoiding for a long time and are finally, for reasons you don't entirely understand, allowing yourself to actually see. And then he said, quietly, carefully, in a voice nobody who worked for him would have recognized, "How long has it been this hard?" 4 words. That undid 7 months of careful maintenance. She opened her mouth to say, "I'm fine." What came out instead was the truth. She told him about her sister, about the family situation she'd been managing from a distance for months, wiring money she'd asked her father not to mention, making calls at midnight when the house was asleep so no one would know. She told him about the loneliness, carefully at first, in the cautious language of a woman very aware of who she's talking to. But he kept listening, kept looking at her with that expression she had no name for, and careful language gradually became honest language. And then she said the last thing, the thing she'd never said out loud, the thing that had been living in her chest for months like a stone she'd learned to breathe around. "I just need to matter to someone in this house who can actually say it back." The children were half asleep against his chest. The silence after she said it was the longest 3 seconds of her life. Park Sung-jin, the man who had not cried at his father's funeral, who had sat across from people who wanted him dead without his expression shifting, felt something move in his face that he recognized, distantly, as the precursor to something he could not stop. He thought about every night he'd come home after the children were already in bed. Every morning he'd left before they woke. Every time he'd noticed Zara doing something extraordinary and filed it away without saying a word, because saying something felt too much like opening something. He thought about how long she had carried this, completely alone, in his house, while mothering his children and holding his household together and keeping herself perfectly intact in public. Something got through every wall he had ever built. Not violently, not dramatically. Just through, the way water finds the one invisible crack. Something moved down his face. He didn't raise his hand to stop it. He didn't look away. He let it happen, for the first time in his adult life. He simply let something happen and looked at her and said, "I'm sorry that I made this a place where you couldn't say that sooner." They didn't go inside for another hour. He shifted the children across both of them, Hana in Zara's lap, Sihua and Minjun anchored against his side. And they talked. Not about the business, not about the arrangement, not about any of the careful structures they'd built between them. He told her about his brother, about the accident, about how the triplets had arrived in his life like a sentence he hadn't known he'd been handed until it was already his life. How he'd looked at them in those first weeks and felt not love first, but terror, the specific terror of someone who knows how badly things can break and doesn't trust himself not to break them too. She didn't rush him, didn't fill the silences with reassurance. Let them have weight. Let him find his way out the other side on his own terms. This, he realized, was what she always did, what she had been doing since week 1. She made space, made it safe to take up space. She'd done it for the children so naturally he'd never registered it, had just noticed the house felt different without understanding why. She'd been making that space for him too. He'd been refusing to step into it. "You move through this house like you're a guest," she said quietly, at some point after 1 in the morning. Not accusing, just observing. The way you say something you've been sitting with a long time and have finally decided the person deserves to hear. He was quiet. "I didn't know how to be anything else here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't say it before." He looked at her. "That's why I'm saying it now." At some point, Minjun woke, looked at both their faces with those ancient child eyes and said, "Inside now." Sung-jin stood, gathered all three children with the practiced lift of a man who had learned more about carrying sleeping toddlers than he'd ever anticipated. And then at the door, pausing, he looked back at Zara and said, "Come on, I'll make tea." She almost laughed. Park Sung-jin making tea at 1 a.m. "You know how to make tea?" she asked. "I'll learn," he said. From a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person who already knew everything, "I'll learn" was possibly the most significant thing he had ever said. She followed him inside. Sung-jin did not become a different man overnight. Let's be honest about that. He was still difficult, still sealed in ways that would take real time to open. Still the kind of person who showed up with solutions when what was needed was simply presence, who had to be gently redirected back to the feeling when his instinct was to manage the problem. But something had shifted, something structural, not a mood, not a late-night vulnerability that would be packed away by morning. He started coming home earlier. Not every night, but enough. Enough that the children started expecting him. Enough that Siwa began saving small things to tell him, with the serene confidence of a child who now believed her audience would show up. He started saying things, small ones. "You handled that well, that made them laugh, I noticed." He noticed. For Zara, that was the part that mattered most. Not declarations, not grand gestures, just being seen. Having someone in the house who could look at what she did and actually register it. She let herself be a little less contained. Let him see the hard days alongside the managed ones. Stopped performing fine quite so fluently. He seemed surprised by her. Also, she noticed, relieved. Like a man who had been waiting for someone to stop pretending and didn't know that's what he'd been waiting for. Some things were still unfinished between them. The arrangement, the formal structure they'd arrived in, still sat between them like a piece of furniture nobody had decided what to do with. They hadn't talked about what this was becoming. What either of them actually wanted now that what they had before was clearly not enough. And there were things she hadn't told him yet. Things about why she'd really said yes to this arrangement. Things her father had told her that she'd shared with no one. Things that would change the shape of everything he thought he understood about how she'd come to be in his house and why she'd stayed. And there were things about him, things connected to a night in Incheon he'd mentioned once, in passing, like it meant nothing, that she was beginning to understand meant everything. A decision he'd made, a debt still outstanding. A person connected to that night who was, if she understood his world correctly, about to walk back into his life. Neither of them knew that yet. Neither of them knew that the quiet, newborn thing they'd built on that cold stone veranda at midnight was about to be tested in ways that would demand they choose, definitively, whether this was real. The most dangerous thing Park Sung-jin ever did, in a life full of genuinely dangerous things, was let himself be seen by someone who had already decided to stay. And the bravest thing Zara ever did, in a situation that asked for bravery every day, was stop pretending to be fine in a house where she was finally, maybe, allowed not to be. 3 children on a cold floor in the dark. A man in a doorway deciding in a single second whether to keep his distance or close it. He closed it. And nothing was the same after that. Fire, but here's what I didn't tell you. The next morning, Sung-jin got a call. A number he hadn't seen in 4 years. A name that made the muscle in his jaw go tight in the specific way that meant something was about to become very complicated, very fast. He took it in his office, door closed, 20 minutes. He came out and looked across the kitchen at Zara. She was making breakfast, Hana on her hip, completely unaware, and his face had that expression on it. The old one, the sealed one, the one she'd thought was starting to crack. She knew, with the instincts of a woman who had been paying very close attention for 7 months, that whoever had just called was connected to her, was connected to why she was in this house in the first place, and had just put something into motion that neither of them was ready for. Team, he needs to tell her everything right now, or team, some things have to stay buried. drop it in the comments. I need to know where you stand before part 2. If this hit you, smash that like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being seen is not weakness. And subscribe because part 2 is coming. And I promise you, you are not prepared. See you in the next one.